All right, Jim, one final question here this week. This one was sent via the Cult of Cornette Facebook group by Donnie Howard. Hypothetical, but what would have happened if Hogan had tried to hold up Vince for an ownership stake before WrestleMania or WrestleMania 2? I always wondered why such a prominently important star never tried.
Ooh, an ownership stake. I'm trying to. I would suggest that Vince was obviously never going to give up any ownership in the company because he had gone to such pains. As the new book that's out now, the new Solomon book's here. Brian Solomon wrote Irresistible Force on the life of Gorilla Monsoon. Vince went to great pains to not only buy his father out, but make sure that he bought all of the partners, had everything all to himself. He wasn't going to give any up 2 years after he had done that. What I'm trying to think is to what he might have told Hogan at the time to get him off of that if Hogan had tried it. And if Hogan had come to him and said, he'd give me some ownership percentage, I mean, even Hogan, even WrestleMania, he would have had to have been somewhat realistic. He wouldn't just say, give me all of this and your goddamn family and let me live in your house. He would have known he had a chance at something maybe. So would he have said, give me 10%, give me 20%, give it whatever, change my deal, whatever it may be. I think if he had asked for ownership, Vince would have probably scared him off with the idea that this experiment was still unproven. If he was part owner, he might be liable for the losses as well as in line for the fucking share of the profits and or any potential lawsuits that may come from these promoters that were starting to fuck around. So maybe, Hulk, you might just want a large cash payment as your ransom for holding me up instead of a piece of the company, which could get sticky in legal matters, maybe something like that Hogan probably would have fell for and bought and been happy to just get a suitcase full of fucking money. What do you think, Brian?
There are very few wrestlers who could have pulled off anything like that. Bruno Sammartino, and in certain towns, he had a better cut than any other wrestler, but he didn't actually own a piece of the territory.
He had a set percentage that he got himself, which no other wrestler had, but he didn't have ownership. But he, at the same time, I don't think he wanted ownership. I think he wanted, because he turned down, because he didn't particularly trust everybody involved, but Vince Sr. at that point, he turned down the opportunity to buy Toots Mont's shares, which is what eventually went to Gorilla in 1969, I believe.
Yeah. I mean, Hogan, again, different than everyone else in history, even Steve Austin. And Steve Austin should have had leverage considering they turned it into a publicly traded company off on the back of Steve Austin. But Steve Austin, I don't even think he was ever the central focus that Hogan was in the 80s.
No, Austin was as big a part as you could be of a much bigger pie, whereas Hogan was just as big, but the pie was smaller and he was more necessary to the survival of the pie.
And in terms of merchandise, I mean, he was outselling everyone. And, the LJN figures, Hulk Hogan was the biggest seller. Hulk Hogan's Rocket Wrestling was in production. Merchandise up the gazoo. It would be interesting if that had ever happened. Now, they were close. I mean, Vince moved Hulk Hogan to Connecticut.
Well, but think about it. He had no reason to hold him up early on. See, that's the thing is, a lot of times also guys could be short-sighted. But usually the time that you held a wrestling promoter up in front of the big show for a big payoff he didn't intend to pay out was the last time that you had dealings with that promoter. Hulk was already figured in. He was already making multiple times more money than all the rest of the guys in 85, 86, 87, 88. Where he may have made a mistake is not ever picking a spot in that 90-91 period to hold up Vince for a fucking life-changing amount of money before it got to the point where he couldn't really hold Vince up for anything that Vince couldn't fucking suffer through. But if he'd held him up in 85, he'd have lost a lot more years because Vince would have known he's my guy now and he's drawing money, but I can't trust him. And I'll work more actively toward finding a way to replace him.
And without knowing the specifics of his deal with Vince throughout the 80s and 90s, he would kind of get the deal you were talking about earlier. You know, the best possible deal you could have, an ownership deal without actually being an owner from WCW. And he had the leverage there. He knew they needed him. He knew Bischoff really wanted him. He was able to get the best deal for a wrestler ever.
But he wouldn't have been able to get any kind of ownership there because of the TBS corporate ownership.
Right.
But, you know, again, and I know there's been some debate about this here recently. I've seen online and people asking various things, and I'll say this and then let you take over. But there's been some, and especially Uncle Dave has weighed in on some of this. The story that I heard about the WrestleMania 3 payoffs was that Jim Barnett was the guy in charge of doing payoffs at the time that WrestleMania 3 happened. And Barnett gave Hogan and Andre $250,000 apiece, and Vince overruled it and gave them $750,000 apiece. And the comment was out there when Hogan passed away here recently that I think from Uncle Dave that was the biggest amount of money that any wrestler earned in one night until, was it Tyson or until some other time. But I also always heard that to placate Hogan and Warrior for different reasons, that weren't they WrestleMania 4 or was it 5?
Hogan and Warrior is WrestleMania 6 in Toronto. Skydome.
6. Okay. 6. Whatever. I heard that they got $1 million apiece just because Vince wanted to be able to claim to them that they got more than Hogan and Andre did, even if it wasn't as important to business and potentially that they had earned it as much. So for whatever that's worth.